WNYC Studios is supported by Earth Justice. As the largest environmental law organization in the country, Earth Justice has more than 200 full-time lawyers who fight for a healthy environment. They wield the power of the law to protect public lands, defend your right to clean air and water, and combat climate change. Earth Justice fights in court because the earth needs a good lawyer. Learn more about how you can get involved and become a supporter at earthjustice.org.
Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Package theft. Those of you who live in buildings, can you even make it through your lobbies yet with all the holiday season packages from Amazon and wherever starting to pile up? Or those of you who live in private homes, can you make it through your porch? But our real question is, do you deal with a lot of package theft? Has this become a bigger issue for you and your neighbors in recent months or years? Also, tips for how you can deal with it so that other listeners can take a page out of perhaps the success in your package theft prevention book. Building supers, landlords, residents, private homeowners. I know package theft happens, in both contexts. Maybe some of you have even heard of the New York City Department of Transportation's pilot program, Locker NYC, where they're setting up public lockers to help ensure safe delivery. But joining us now to talk about this is Julie Bessanen, who has an article in the New York Times, actually from a few years ago, about how her East Village building came together to address a rampant package theft problem there and then. Hey, Julie, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So do you have a success story?
We had some success. No, it's a problem all over again because my building has a lot of turnover since it's close to NYU and Cooper Union. So we get a new batch of students usually every fall. And so we successfully battled it in 2021. The package theft got terrible during the pandemic. And so we banded together and started taking in packages for each other, carrying them up the stairs. And that really seemed to work. We got our landlord to put in a camera so we could see how they were getting in. And in one case, a man who stole one of my packages was just able to open the front door with either a credit card or a Metro card. And so they fixed the lock. But now it's happening again, and we have new residents who are putting up signs saying, please return my package, no questions asked. And that's how it always starts, is with blame. You think it's happening. It's a fellow tenant stealing, and then I have to set them straight and say, no, there's people getting in the building somehow.
I want to bring on a longtime superintendent of a building in Chelsea who's been coming up with ways, I'm told, to help his residents deal with package theft for years now and might have some tips. It's Dominic Romeo. Dominic, welcome to WNYC.
Thank you for having me. Season's greetings.
Season's greetings to you. So what do you do at your building?
So the caller that you're speaking to right now raises a really good point. Points of entry are very important, and you're not going to know what they are until you have a camera system. So the first thing I recommend is indeed a camera system to figure out how they're getting in. Once you figure out how they're getting in, call a locksmith to try to prevent them in the future for doing that. You can add like one of those guards that blocks them from using credit cards to pick the locks with, which is one of the main reasons or ways for them to get in. But the biggest way for a resident to get their package stolen is simply by one of these package thieves, or Grinches, I call them around the holiday season, is to ring somebody's bell. That's one of my biggest problems as a building superintendent. You can be proactive all you want and block them as much as you can, but it really is educating your tenants in regards to not letting them in the first place, and to look for the signs. If you have a video intercom, You can see their face. If they're wearing a facial mask with a hat to cover their face, they are definitely going to steal your package. If they're holding a large tote bag, these tote bags, as I write to my residents every year, are not meant to drop off your packages. They're meant to haul away your packages. So if you have a video and you can see them with a giant tote bag covering their face, they're going to be a package thief. So don't let them in the first place is my recommendation. It's about educating the tenants of what I've observed and all the little tricks that they perform to get into your building.
That's a number of very good tips right there. Listener writes, package theft is a massive problem at my building in Prospect Park South in Brooklyn. Amazon installed a locker in the lobby, which helps, but everything else gets stolen. I have all my non-Amazon packages sent to a friend's apartment in the neighborhood whose building has a package cage. Joanna in Dobbs Ferry, you're on WNYC. Hi, Joanna.
Hi. I don't know if you've seen, but there are so many videos out there of people sabotaging the packages or putting fake packages out just to lure people up. They get out of their car, you see them on the camera at the front door, they come up, they pick up a package, they get to their car, and it explodes. And it's just filled with like spray paint, spray glitter, spray pink stuff all over their face and hands, and they like drop it and don't know what to do. It's a great way to to stop people from doing it. It's wonderfully funny.
Although people may be stealing the real packages alongside the fake packages if there isn't better security, right?
That's true. I just think people are getting so fed up with it that they put out ones to get the person who's doing it, and there's a whole string of videos put together of people doing this. They run up to the front doorstep, grab the package, get to the car, boom, and they're standing there with blue muck all over their face and clothes and inside the car. It's just fantastic.
Well, I hope it's only damaging enough to be good for a laugh and nobody's actually getting hurt. But Celia in Washington Heights, you're on WNYC. Hi, Celia.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for taking my call. I live in an older building built in 1915, and it has an exterior door into a sort of a pre-lobby, and then the door from that pre-lobby into the big lobby. It's just a kind of a large cavernous space. We have had problems with this since before the pandemic. It got really bad during that period, and the super here convinced the building management company to put in a lockbox where they would get in touch with anybody who was in the building who was getting a package, and then let you know that you had the package in the lockbox, and you then had to go down. You have to go down and get it yourself. That worked very, very well for quite a while. But in recent years, like this year, last year, and perhaps before, it's been the problem has been growing again. That many of the people who do the deliveries don't know that there is a lockbox, don't know how to use it, don't care. Perhaps also some of them, and they leave it. They leave things in the lobby. Now, the only thing that I ever found that worked was where there was a place on an order form to leave a message for the carrier. I would say leave in lockbox in lobby, and I actually left instructions.
Oh,
okay?
that's interesting too. Dominic, did I hear you having a reaction to some of that?
Yeah, I have to go against, although they are fun videos to watch when there's paint exploded in people's faces. Keep in mind, these are just internet stunts for people to get likes, and anything using explosives could force some sort of projectile and accidentally maim somebody, and then you're in trouble legally. So steer away from anything you see on the internet is always good advice. But one thing that I do that I recommend everyone does is, as soon as you get a package stolen and you have a visual picture of them, post that picture saying, my building has just gotten packages stolen from this person. Please do not let people into your building that you don't know, and look for the telltale signs of if they're wearing a facial mask, don't let them in. If they're wearing a construction vest, those yellow construction vests, I inform my residents that every courier has a uniform, and none of their uniforms consist of a construction vest. So if you see somebody with a construction vest that's trying to get into the building claiming to be Amazon, it's not Amazon. And this is about having your community, your building, be aware of these things to prevent people from coming in the first place.
You have a lot of good visual tips that you've been giving. Julie, your building, I understand, transitioned a few years ago from a mom and pop landlord to a real estate company. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the management company response is different from the mom and pop response?
Well, very much so, because when it was owned by mom and pop family, we had a live-in super, and so that super would also take in packages for us. And the first order of business when the real estate company bought it was to kick out the super. So we just have a remote kind of super who comes around, and it's very difficult to get them to respond. They had disconnected the cameras when they were renovating the building, and so we had to get every single tenant to sign a petition to get the cameras reinstalled so we could see how people were getting in. And there's just a much more lack of response, I would say.
Do either of you know, we just have 20 seconds, when people get caught, are they being prosecuted?
I don't know.
Not at all.
And also with my neighbors, they rarely report the theft. They just order it again and have it replaced.
Dominic, you say no. Do you want that?
Yes, I would like that. This falls into line with the broken windows theory, where every little crime matters. And the problem with what I've been experiencing is that a lot of these companies don't have, they have insurance for their goods that get stolen. So they don't mind sending a new product. Whereas if you actually had to pay for this product again, we wouldn't see it this go on for too long.
Julie and Dominic, thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your tips. We really appreciate it.
The headlines never stop, and it's harder than ever to tell what's real, what matters, and what's just noise. That's where Pod Save America comes in. I'm Tommy Vitor, and every week I'm joined by fellow former Obama aides John Favreau, John Lovett, and Dan Pfeiffer to break down the biggest stories, unpack what they mean for the future of our democracy, and add just enough humor to stay sane along the way. You'll also hear honest, in-depth conversations with big voices in politics, media, and culture, like Rachel Maddow, Gavin Newsom, and Mark Cuban, that you won't find anywhere else. New episodes drop every Tuesday and Friday, with deep dives every other weekend. Listen wherever you get your podcasts, watch on YouTube, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts for ad-free episodes.
Good afternoon, my fellow New Yorkers. This morning I took the oath of office to become your mayor. Just after midnight in Times Square, with thousands of people gathered to ring in the new year.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. So before New York City heads into a new year and the new era, the Mayor's Around Mamdani era, let's take a few minutes to digest where we've been the last 4 years in the Mayor Eric Adams era. That clip was from the speech he gave on the day of his inauguration, New Year's Day, 4 years ago, January 1st, 2022. And what a different time that was, right? With the city still in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Omicron variant was raging with 40,000 new cases a day. And there were the other problems that came with the pandemic. Here's a minute of how Mayor Adams tried to set a new direction at the start of that new year.
Yet, unemployment remains high. Crime is high. COVID cases are high again. So how do we get our city back? My fellow New Yorkers, the answer is simple. We will get our city back by making a commitment to each other right here, right now, beginning today. This will be our New Year's resolution. We will not be controlled by crisis. Instead, we'll make this city better every day through actions big and small. Getting vaccinated is not letting the crisis control you. Enjoying a Broadway show, sending your kids to school, going back to the office, these are declarations of confidence that our city is our own. Of course, government must do its job to allow New Yorkers to make these choices safely.
Mayor Adams on his first day in office, January 1st, 2022. We'll sample some more from that day one speech and a few things since as we discuss and digest the Eric Adams years now before we fully move on to the Mamdani years. We'll do this with an all-star roundtable of New York City journalists and with you. We have three guests who have all covered the Adams years throughout. WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffrey Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. Hi, Liz. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Ben. And Liz, remind us, why was Mayor Adams elected, if we can turn back the clock 4 years and a little, mostly in the first ever ranked choice voting Democratic primary, right? Despite having a field of high-profile competitors, Maya Wiley, Andrew Yang, and the one the New York Times had endorsed, Catherine Garcia.
Well, as you reminded listeners, Brian, we were in the throes of a pandemic. And we were also coming off the height of the Black Lives Movement and the George Floyd protests in 2020. And what I remember about that race in 2021 is that early on, there were these dueling concerns. You know, for one thing, people were worried, how does New York City recover and come out of the pandemic? How does someone help the city reopen? And then there was this social justice question that was brought on by the Black Lives Movement. But then there was as there often is in these kinds of races, there was a turning point. And that turning point was a shooting in Times Square. There were 4 people injured. One of them was a child. And from that point forward, what happened was public safety became the overriding concern. And that was really, I thought, what catapulted Eric Adams into being one of the major contenders. Now, again, it was still close because he beat Catherine Garcia, his main competitor in that race, who was the former sanitation commissioner, by less than 10,000 points. So these two concerns of, wanting this sort of Uber manager technocrat was there among New Yorkers, but also this idea of this unease with crime rising in the city.
Yeah. So Jeff Mays from the Times. I'm looking at the Times article from that day, January 1st, 2022, by your colleague Emma Fitzsimmons, that reflected some of what the mayor was referencing in the clips, including the 40,000 per day Omicron variant COVID spike of that moment, and a 9.4% unemployment rate, more than double the national average. So I'm curious if you heard that day one speech that we sampled from as kind of a pep talk for the city more than a policy address.
Absolutely. I think Mayor Adams, one of his supporters believe one of his biggest accomplishments that they feel is often overlooked is the fact that he did inherit the city, as the pandemic was still going on. There were still lots of issues. Places were closed. There were lots of people still contracting COVID. There were concerns about safety, as Liz mentioned, on the subway, in terms of people feeling safe enough to use the subway. So I think through his tenure, that idea of him being at the helm of the city during this very difficult time, having to lead the city out of the pandemic. I talked to one of his former staffers today, and they said they thought that was one of his biggest accomplishments, but he doesn't get enough credit for leading the city during that difficult time.
So here's another clip from that day one speech. And yes, COVID was still the defining feature of public life in many ways. But Adams also made sure to address some of the perennial issues that tend to face the city and his intention to address those.
Our government has been dysfunctional for far too long, and it created its own crisis long before COVID. Whether it was crime-ridden communities, poor schools, economic inequality, or racial injustice, our problems have been normalized for generations while New York's government struggled to match the energy and innovation of New Yorkers. That changes today. I promise you one thing, New York. I will make our city better every day by making our city government better every day.
And listeners, you're invited in this conversation too. What's most memorable to you about the Eric Adams years? 212-433-WNYC. What did he do well or not? But let's not make this all about the corruption and political stuff. Did he have policy successes that are too little noted because of all the political and corruption stuff? Or do you think he didn't do so well on that either? 212-433-9692 on the things he mentioned in that clip, on education, on racial justice, on economic inequality, on crime, as well as digging us out from COVID. And of course, we're going to talk about the migrant surge as one of the defining features of the Adams years too, which he wasn't talking about on day one there. But 212-433-WNYC, what stands out as most memorable to you about the Eric Adams years? 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. So Ben Max, looking back, did Adams have an agenda for any of those things that was strikingly new or aggressive for any of those perennial challenges he mentioned in that clip on day one? Crime, poor schools, economic inequality, or racial justice?
I don't know if he had anything particularly revolutionary that he introduced, but I would say on several of those fronts he advanced some significant policy. Obviously, he was elected to, in large part, be a public safety mayor, and through the police department, they enacted a number of crime-fighting strategies. In the schools, he focused on literacy overhaul, and that's going to be one of his probably biggest legacy items, at least on the positive side, was taking a real focus on trying to improve literacy and reading rates in the early school years. And then on things like economic inequality, racial justice, I think one of his biggest focus areas was this combination of housing policy and economic development, and he's got a lot of achievements on both of those to point to. One of the sort of under the radar aspects of the Adams years, he gets a lot of credit broadly for housing policy, but he's done housing policy in something of a sort of fair housing policy lens. That includes the recent ballot measures that were passed by one of his charter revision commissions and the way that he passed the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity rezoning that increases housing supply across the city, which is something he ran on, this idea that especially wealthier and whiter neighborhoods in the city could not be exclusionary to new housing. But I would say on the crime front, to come back to the beginning of the point here, one of the things that happened in the Adams years, and we could, of course, get into a lot more detail on this, is that while he focused on some of these priority areas, he repeatedly undermined himself through his mismanagement of government, through some of the bad appointments that he made. The lack of a clear chain of command particularly hurt him with the NYPD, and it took years for the House to really get in order there after a lot of scandal and dysfunction that clearly held back some of the potentially good or clearly good policy that he was putting into place.
Some texts that are coming in. Listener writes, sorry about that. I had them all set to go, and then a bunch additional text came in, and they are off my screen. But here we go. Adams' greatest legacy will be coining the term rat czar. Another one says, Adams lost me when he tried to balance the city on the backs of the libraries multiple times. Another one says, Adams added a lot of bike lanes. Appreciate that as a green pointer. Another one says, I'd be interested to hear your guest opinions on how Adams used and acknowledged race in his governance, specifically how he used his identity as a black man. And Liz, on that, on economic inequality and where it intersects with racial injustice, two of the terms he cited in that clip, Adams was, of course, only the city's second black mayor, and he always emphasized being from the working class as well. And you reminded me yesterday off the air of his campaign promise to enact an earned income tax credit. So can you take us back to that promise and its context, or respond in any way to that listener?
Sure, Brian. And this is a policy that I've written about a lot. And I wrote about it starting during the campaign. And it was something that I knew that Adams's campaign was interested in because I knew that they had talked to James Parrott. He's a veteran economist. He's long lobbied the city to expand the earned income tax credit because he believes that this is the fastest way to put real cash in the pockets of low-income working New Yorkers. And to the mayor's credit, he did that. And he not only did it, but he did it really in his first year. In order to do this, he needed to go to Albany. He needed to get permission from Albany to get the city to really more than double its contribution to this tax credit program. It went from $100 million to $250 million. And then the state also agreed to chip in its own money as well. And, the last I looked, I saw there was a press release that the mayor put out maybe like a year ago where he said that in total, that program has delivered $345 million to these low-income New Yorkers that have to apply. I mean, it's a program, it doesn't just go to you. You do have to apply. But to the city's credit, they did run an advertising campaign to help New Yorkers fill out their taxes. And part of it was to get people who qualified for a program like this to get the money.
Jeff, any thoughts from you in any direction on how Adams tried to lean into the distinction of being the second black mayor and use that distinction or his life experience to aim for more racial justice and less economic inequality, which tends to run along racial lines in New York?
Yeah, I think Mayor Adams, from almost the start of his term, sought to place himself in the lineage of David Dinkins. It had been, over 30 years since the city has had a black mayor and David Dinkins. And a lot of people believe, time has sort of changed how people viewed Mayor Dinkins. A lot of people believe there were accomplishments, successes that were downplayed, that maybe he was treated harshly in some instances where he shouldn't have been treated. Looking at a lot of his accomplishments that came out, such as sort of addressing crime and Times Square, the tennis center, those were things that people came to appreciate about David Dinkins later, as well as the fact that he took over the city at a time of serious racial animus and made it his goal to sort of bring New Yorkers together. So in a very powerful way, Eric Adams, really tried to place himself in that lineage, especially when he got into trouble. There was one point where he was going around calling himself Dinkins 2, which was pretty striking. And he made the point that David Dinkins was treated unfairly, and that the accomplishments that he was making were not being viewed fairly. So he talked about things like increasing the minority women business program. He talked about the diversity of his administration, which is true. He had a lot of women of color in positions for the first time where they had never been in city government before. The problem with the comparison, many people thought, was that it did a disservice to David Dinkins, who was never accused of any serious corruption. There was one sort of investigation into some stock transfer with his son that amounted to not much. But Eric Adams faced serious charges of corruption, was the first modern mayor in New York City history to face indictment. And on top of that, many people in his administration also faced federal investigation. So I give the mayor was a master at talking about this issue in terms of a racial lens, and especially sort of trying to use that to his advantage. And I think it worked in a lot of ways. Up until the very end, black voters were his strongest supporters. It wasn't until he began aligning himself with President Trump on issues that you saw black support start to finally peel away. And I think what it says about New York City is interesting that we've only had two black mayors, and it's been 30 years. It was 30 years between those two black mayors in a city that considers itself very progressive and forward-looking.
Interesting that you brought up corruption, his corruption issues, in the middle of that question or answer, which was largely otherwise about policy. And so interestingly, we have two texts that are almost identical to each other, but from two different phone numbers, but referencing the same dark joke from the past. And this one says, setting aside the corruption, how has the Adams administration done, is a little like asking, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? So we'll get more into the corruption scandal history as we go. But Liz, Jeff referenced Adams comparing himself to Dinkins, less maybe in terms of what he tried to do at a policy level or somewhat with that, but maybe even more so on how he was perceived or how he was covered. And one way that Adams explicitly brought up race, as Jeff was indicating, was in criticizing his press coverage. So here's a clip from February 2022, just 1 month into his term, after he failed to win bail reform rollbacks during meetings in Albany.
I'm a black man, that's the mayor. But my story has been interpreted by people that don't look like me. We got to be honest about that. How many blacks are in the editorial boards? How many blacks are determining how these stories are being written?
And so, Liz, I'm going to turn right back to you on this because you were in the room for his weekly news conferences for basically all of those 4 years. He's undoubtedly right about the stats, I imagine. But do you think that kind of critique, which he would come back to periodically, influenced how he was covered, either with more racial sensitivity or as someone who was using the issue unfairly as a cover?
I'm so glad you played that clip, Brian, because, like you said, it's a month into his term, and it's a reminder of how early he brought up this issue. I mean, it did intensify, especially, post-indictment, but very early on, he brought up this issue of race and raised questions about whether a mostly white press corps could cover him fairly. Now, like you said, I don't doubt the statistics that he cites. And, this was something that I wrestled with, too, in the room watching him, because I don't doubt that, the coverage, the perception of him is shaped by race. I think that it's very hard to say that is not a lens with which we all view the world, right? But just like Jeff said, he was very masterful in the way he used race to put the press corps on the defensive. And I think he was largely successful in really shielding himself from maybe some even tougher questions that he should have gotten, because he put, like I said, it was largely a white press corps on the defensive, because again and again he would bring up this question of race. And I thought another way he used it really well, and I think this is also partly who the mayor is too and his backstory, but his insistence on decorum and how reporters should talk to him. And that was something that he instilled in that, once he started doing those regular City Hall press conferences in the Blue Room, would come up again and again. And what it does is that it really puts the press corps on their heels, because he's saying, you can't talk to me this way. And it makes it a lot tougher to really grill the mayor.
We'll continue in a minute with the Eric Adams years on WNYC before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years, and with our reporters and with you. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433 9692. Call or text. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we discuss the Eric Adams years in New York City. Before segueing into the Zohran Mamdani years, our guests are WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeff Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School Center for New York City Law. And we're inviting your calls and texts. What was most memorable for you about the Adams years, on success, on the level of success, on the level of failure, how the corruption scandals intersected with any of that or anything else? 212-433-WNYC. You can call or text 212-433-9692. Ben, if COVID was the crisis that defined the beginning of Adams' term, the mass migration of asylum seekers to the city largely defined the middle of his term, I think we can say, and then became entwined with his defense and his corruption scandal and the eventual dropping of the charges, or at least suspension of the charges, by the Trump administration. Now, to set this up, here's one more clip from his Inauguration Day speech in which he recalls the fiscal crisis of the 1970s to proclaim that nothing can destroy this city.
When this city was facing a financial crisis that set it on the verge of ruin, Mayor Koch said, "These have been hard times. We have been tested by fire. We have been drawn across the knife edge of poverty. We have been inundated by problems. We have been shaken by troubles that have destroyed any other city would have destroyed. But we are not any other city. We are New York."
We are not any other city. We are New York. Other things or other cities would have been destroyed. Use that word by issues that he cited there. But the next year, he was singing a different tune. Here's one of the most memorable sound bites from the Adams years from September 2023.
"Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City."
So, Ben Max, how do you begin to assess how Mayor Adams handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City?
Yeah, so this is really the defining crisis, at least the not self-inflicted one of Eric Adams' term, and every mayor gets at least one big crisis out of their control, it seems. So I would say a few things on this that are worth thinking about. One, to connect it to the prior topic, there's a through line of Eric Adams doing a lot of excuse making, lashing out, blaming other people for issues that he was confronting, sometimes with validity, sometimes without. And so when we talk about things like how he approached the press or how he discussed his record in Albany, which was, part of the prior clip you played about, lashing out at the press, or the migrant crisis or many other things, there is a lot of excuse-making, divisive commentary like that this issue would destroy the city and so forth. On this issue in particular, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. One is this is an immense challenge, very difficult to have well over 200,000 migrant asylum seekers come to the city over the course of a few years and need services and shelter and largely unable to work, as Adams regularly pointed out. So it was a mixed bag in terms of the logistical and the humanitarian response here, but there is a lot of room to give credit to the administration for many steps they took to provide services to people. There were a lot of trial and tribulation along the way, including some issues with how some people were treated, challenges with picking sites and sort of sometimes wasted energy or resources on setting up encampments that had to be taken down and things of that nature. But they clearly did a very big lift on the logistics and the humanitarian aid. You can also raise questions about whether they stayed in crisis mode too long or didn't provide enough legal services and things of that nature. But on the broader issue of how a mayor leads the city through a crisis, Eric Adams really failed on this. And the clip you played is really essential to that. He did a lot of talking about sort of us versus them, He did a lot of blame casting. And while the federal government under President Biden clearly should have been a lot more helpful to the city, and then towards the end of the Biden years, they did close down the border essentially far too late in terms of sort of getting their arms around this. Eric Adams did not handle this well and did not portray a strong sense of leadership and that he had his hands on the wheel, so to speak, to the city. And I think this is part of the root of why his approval numbers were tanking well before he was indicted, was that he did not show strong leadership during this moment of crisis and was seen, I think, by many New Yorkers as casting blame on migrants and speaking particularly divisively a lot of the times. Meanwhile, he was doing what one of the listeners texted, cutting library funding and going through all sorts of battles that other New Yorkers viewed as either unnecessary or particularly unhelpful.
Of course, there were some other texts coming in about positive things that he did. One, the Adams initiative to get loose garbage bags off the streets into bins will be a major improvement in city life. If it works, another listener writes, no fan of Adams, but bias and racial/racist double standard in New York City news media coverage is real and obvious, not only as it relates to politics, but to everything else, including crime. We're going to get to crime as a separate topic here. Listener asks, does the panel have any thoughts or reflections on how Adams' mayoralty might have led to the re-election of Trump? We'll talk about that. But Liz, same question that I just asked Ben. How do you begin to assess how Mayor Adams handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City?
You know, one of the feelings I've always had with Adams, and it came pretty quickly, was that my sense of him was that the way he wanted to do the job was he wanted to be, you know, what I remember talking to this one government veteran who told me that, you know, there are two kinds of mayors. You can be an outside mayor where you're sort of out there cheering the city on, or you can be an inside mayor where you're very, very steeped in all the policy and all the political decisions that are coming out of City Hall. And my sense was that Eric Adams, with the one exception of policing and public safety, wanted to be an outside mayor. He wanted to be out there for the ribbon cuttings. He wanted to be out there giving press conferences, you know, interacting with the public, because those are the things he was actually really good at. He had a lot of natural charisma. But what you saw early on as a result of this is there was this strange dichotomy. There was Eric Adams and what he would say on the podium about migrants and the migrant crisis, and then there was actually what his administration was doing on the ground. So I find for me, it's difficult to assess, you know, something like how he handled the migrant crisis, because I think you can make the argument that if you look on the ground and how they stood up all of those hotels, and even this concept of coming up with a welcome center where they kind of centralized a place for all the migrants to stop, to check in, you know, at the Roosevelt Hotel. I mean, the city did that on a very short time period, and they processed a lot of people. They helped a lot of people with their applications. But then, you know, you had the mayor who's at the podium and who's saying things like the clip you played, which is completely undermining the actual policy making that's coming out of his administration. Now, you can make the argument that at the end of the day, you know, the mayor is responsible for all of it. He's responsible for the rhetoric and he's responsible for the policy. I just don't know, you know, how do you reckon with both of these dueling, you know, opposite kind of, you know, directions of his administration.
And here's a text before I ask you the same question, Jeff. Why didn't Adams do a better job of blaming Southern GOP governors sending migrants with one-way tickets to New York City and blue states? But same question generally on your take about how he handled the surge of asylum seekers and why he used that phrase, destroy New York City.
Yeah, I think the mayor was strongly focused on this crisis. He recognized how difficult this would be for the city, as migrants were bussed into the city and sent to the city and began flooding the city, you saw a space for individuals in shelters who need help, sort of longer time city residents being blocked up. So I think the mayor was focused on this. They did do a good job of opening shelters very quickly, which is a very complicated task. And, as the mayor often likes to point out, there were not like encampments on the street of migrants who had no housing. So I think he gets credit for that. I just think he made a series of errors that raised concerns about his management abilities, for example. Attacking President Biden at that moment did not necessarily appear to be something that you might want to do when you are asking for more assistance from them. Secondly, a lot of people believe he wasn't innovative enough in this crisis. A lot of times a crisis, I think it was Barack Obama who said that you use a crisis as a time for innovation, a time to make change. I know for a fact that advocates were saying, hey, let's change our voucher laws. Let's change the system. Let's get more people into permanent housing, and that would clear up space in the shelter system. People like Christine Quinn, who runs WIN, a shelter for women, was saying this many times. Let's make changes. Let's use this crisis to make changes in how we treat people in the city. Again, the city was slow to set up centers to help migrants apply for asylum. One of Mayor Adams' biggest complaints was that you had migrants here who could not work, legally could not work. But many of those people had asylum claims that would have potentially allowed them to work while they were here. The city was very slow to set up those centers to begin processing people's sort of claims of asylum. And I think he just made a series of other mistakes. I think as a mayor, you don't want to show the sort of fearfulness that he showed and played in that clip that you played about that this is going to destroy the city. Certainly, New York City is a city of immigrants, and we have historically absorbed large numbers of newcomers to the city. So to say that this crisis was going to destroy the city, a lot of people felt like the mayor just lacked imagination and creativeness in sort of how he spoke about that. He also made a number of mistakes where I think he linked migrants to crime, which, all statistics show that's not true, that, most people who are immigrants to this country actually have lower rates of committing crimes than other people. So I think while they have some accomplishments and this was a huge crisis, right? Buses were flooding in, hundreds of people were showing up every day. So it was a difficult crisis, but I feel like it sort of tested the mayor's ability to manage the city, which a lot of people had raised questions before he was elected because he had only been a borough president before becoming mayor of the largest and most complex city in the country.
Jeff, to that point you just made about him associating, and maybe wrongfully, migrants with crime, it kind of goes to that question we got in the text message from the listener who wanted to know if you thought that the way he dealt with the migrant crisis helped lead to the re-election of President Trump. I don't know if it, could have influenced that many people who were voting in swing states like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, but any thought on that?
I think it certainly served a lot of Republicans to have the black Democratic mayor of New York City sort of talking about migrants in the same way that you found a lot of Republicans talking about migrants as a danger, as a nuisance, instead of how New York City has traditionally looked at immigrants as a asset, as people who start their own businesses, people who do jobs that other New Yorkers don't necessarily want to do, who work long hours, who are law-abiding. So that really was a real mistake on his part. And I think it hurt him with his base. Mayor Adams had a very interesting base coming into office, a lot of immigrants, Haitian immigrants, people from Africa. So if he's equating migrants with crime, and just talking about them in this way as a nuisance to the city, as something that's going to destroy the city, that really turned off a lot of his supporters who actually helped him win office in the first place.
And Brian,
Peter, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, just briefly, sorry. It wasn't the exact question that the listener asked, but it absolutely, in my view, contributed to Republican gains in New York in the House races at that time that helped ensure a flip of the House. And Adams then was talking about how Democrats weren't delivering, and that was part of the reason for Democratic losses in that election. But he previously had contributed to the atmosphere that voters, I think, held Democrats responsible for previously.
I think Peter in Newark has some thoughts about the Adams years before we segue into the Mamdani years. Peter, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Thank you. I think Adam overall was a good mayor. He got less credit than he deserved. He took us from COVID. He cleaned up New York City. Everybody's now happy to go on the subway. Everybody forgot that. The first thing a leader needs to do is to secure the city. And he did it. Everybody can walk around. You guys forgot that. The crisis he had with immigrants, what other mayor had it and was successful? He complained about Biden opening the border and not helping him. You guys forgot about that? Which other mayor confronted that huge crisis? Nobody. I think because he was black, people gave him less credit than he deserved. He did a whole lot of things that was good. And everybody's complaining. Every mayor has their own problem. Corruption, he was never convicted. The whole corruption is alleged. Was he went to court? Everybody is innocent in their conviction. What's his conviction? What did he do as a mayor? De Blasio had a problem, too, with the campaign reform. The U.S. Ferrari and exonerated him. Cuomo had issue with the appointment of the corruption committee. When it came to him, he dissolved them. Mayor Adam on every issue was good. Manzani promised all this promise. Where is he going to get the money? We're going to see what's going to happen.
Let's hold the Mamdani thoughts till later, but thank you very much for all that on Adams. Arnaldo in Brooklyn may have some different opinions. Arnaldo, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. I just want to say that I always hated the fact that the mayor always compared himself to David Dinkins. Look, I wasn't a supporter of David Dinkins, but I think David Dinkins was an honest man, a really classy guy. And that is the wrong comparison. The mayor, and I knew this even before he became mayor, he was really just exactly like Jimmy Walker, the mayor of New York in the 20s, the Irish mayor. And that mayor was the same as he is. He loved the nightlife. He loved dressing very well. And both of them had been state senators. And in the end, Jimmy Walker is found to be involved in a big scandal and has to leave office and go off to Europe. And basically, it's not a question of whether you've been convicted. It's a question of all the obvious corruption and cronyism that there was in this administration. And that's all I have to say.
Arnaldo, thank you very much. Fair or not, interesting historical comparison to Jimmy Walker. Marty in Yonkers, you're on WNYC. Hi, Marty.
Hi, I'm a registered dietitian, and I moved back to the New York area in 2021. And I was looking for a couple of jobs, and I have to say that I was very impressed with the plant-forward thinking that was going on through the Adams administration as far as working with the medical systems in New York. There really wasn't anything that I had seen the last couple places that I had lived where there was this thought of, if we want long-term care and if we want to help people get out of this and now return to our hospital, we need to think about their long-term diet. And I just thought that was very impressive. And I got to work with am looking at projects now to work with people who are either leaving the mayor's office. And I just think that was a really wonderful thing to come into. And I've been doing nutrition research for over 20 years. And we just know that if you bring more plants in, you're going to decrease the risk of these chronic diseases that we have, including dementia. So I just thought it was really forward-thinking.
Thank you very much. And Noah in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Noah.
Hi there, Brian. Thanks for taking the call. So I was actually part of a immigration rights organization, no longer work there, but we were there in the ground at Port Authority first receiving asylum seekers. And I will say firsthand, and I'm not representing this organization anymore, but I will say my experience, the Adams administration lacked just basic, not even administrative or logistical function, but like event planning capacity. Like they didn't have the ability to throw a birthday party, let alone an immigration influx response and intake. They were relying largely on nonprofits and volunteers, and clearly we're not ready. And I know some people may say, oh, who had to deal with this before? If you're signing up to be mayor of New York City, you're signing up for potentially anything, and you make contingencies. And for someone who, allegedly, protected the streets of New York for 20 years as a New York City police department officer, Adams really just was not thinking about all the possibilities for the welfare and safety of these new New Yorkers who are receiving. And I also just want to note that I'm a little concerned by how many things have been mentioned here about crime in this conversation y'all have been having, and just sort of taking the unchallenged and unexamined premise that policing actually has anything to do with public safety, because that's not a data-supported conclusion, and certainly not in the case of the NYPD, which, even during its slowdowns has seen crime decreases regardless of what they do. So, yeah, I'm very happy to see Adams go and excited to see what Zoran does. Thanks for taking my call.
Noah, thank you very much. And I don't think in this hour we're going to get into the real, nuts and bolts of how much policing does to knock down crime versus other things. But Noah, thank you for your call. Thanks to everybody in that set of callers. And then as we continue on the timeline, when Adams was charged with corruption by the Biden Justice Department, he claimed it was political payback for his criticisms of the president on the migrant surge. And then the Trump Justice Department, as you all know, suspended those charges, saying even in a court filing that it was so he could help them with their deportation agenda. If you never heard the exact quote, I'm going to read it here. I have the actual brief open and from the Trump administration, and it says the pending prosecution has unduly restricted Mayor Adams' ability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime that escalated under the policies of the prior administration. Again, inability to devote full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime, hanging that on the pending prosecution. So was it a political quid pro quo? Jeff Mays from the New York Times, was there this memorable soundbite? Well, I'm going to play a memorable soundbite from earlier this year when the mayor appeared on Fox and Friends with border czar Tom Homan, and they had this little exchange, which begins with the host, Steve Ducey.
You are sitting today talking about the new alliance between ICE and Adams. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Alliance was never severe.
Yeah, and if he doesn't come through, you're up early anyway. If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, "Where the hell is the agreement we came to?"
The agreement we came to. So ultimately, the court closed the case permanently and ruled that, quote, everything here smacks of a bargain. Jeff, how much do you think that whole intersection between Adams' responses to Trump and Biden immigration policy and how his corruption case went is the reason we're not sitting here today previewing Eric Adams' second term rather than anticipating Mamdani's?
Yeah, that interview was particularly disastrous for him. Talking to other political leaders in the city, I did a story about how black political leaders felt embarrassed for him having to sit there and endure those comments from Tom Homan. And it was one of the reasons that I think, he lost even more support. It led to questions of whether he was compromised. Governor Hochul had to come intervene and sort of help with personnel decisions because there was concerns about him being compromised. We had, several top officials in his administration who resigned because they were concerned that the charges against the mayor were being dropped and that he would be beholden to President Trump for dismissing those charges. And so, as I was talking to people preparing for this interview today, they often cite that moment as just one of the moments where people felt like his mayoralty was done. To be the mayor of the largest, most important city in the country and to appear to have the federal government saying that they control you was just damage that I don't think he could come back from.
Liz Kim, same question.
No, I agree with Jeff. I think that ultimately you can make the argument that the perception of a quid pro quo, the allegation from a top federal prosecutor that there was a quid pro quo, was more damaging than the indictment itself, for him politically at least, and his ability to run for re-election.
Ben, anything to add?
Well, I would just say, I think it's important in the historical record here to say there's, zero evidence that the Biden Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, Damian Williams, brought a case against Eric Adams as retribution for his criticism over the migrant crisis, as Adams alleged. There's, zero evidence of that, and it appears that the, investigation had opened well before that incident, that crisis unfolded, and Adams started to criticize Biden. And then lastly, I would say there's whether there was a clear quid pro quo or, as Tom Homan said, the agreement we came to, there was obviously an understanding at play here, and that helped torpedo any last support Eric Adams had. And this idea, as Jeff got at, that he then saw this wave of departures from some of his best appointees of the administration, people with real policy expertise and accomplishments and integrity like Maria Torres Springer and Mira Joshi and others, again, reinforce so much of what voters already saw in Eric Adams with so much controversy and the turnover in his administration, so many police commissioners and others leaving the administration. There were these close friends of Eric Adams who he appointed to positions that are, again, a through line of these Adams years, whether it was Tim Pearson or Phil Banks and others, that undermined so much of what he otherwise was trying to do, that were embroiled in their own set of controversies and investigations.
And Brian, can I just add, those concerns continued even through the mayor's tenure. There was one point where he started speaking out about the use of bathrooms, gender identity, and, who should be allowed to use bathrooms in our schools. And, they were talking points that seemed directly from Republican politicians in this country. And there was just a lot of concern about how the dismissal of the indictment may have affected the remainder of his tenure and his positions, and that some people believed he was compromised. Of course, the mayor says that's not the case. He has strongly denied that. But you can't help that perception was out there, and people acted on it, leaving very good jobs because they were concerned about not being tarnished with this administration.
Catherine on the Upper West Side, you're on WNYC. Hi, Catherine.
Good morning, and thank you, Brian, and all. I think one of his greatest failures was not to follow through on de Blasio's arguably greatest, unprecedented in the country achievement, free pre-K. Adams would have had to have the organizational ability, the will, to promote it in the poorest neighborhoods. He left so many neighborhoods and schools uncovered and unexposed the ability to access this. And I think that was an enormous failure for the first allegedly working class mayor.
Catherine, thank you very much. So, Liz, to Catherine's point, and also to Adams on education generally, I think some people see him as being successful for having restored phonics-based reading instruction. We know he came in, at least, talking about his own history of dyslexia as a child and how he was going to try to address those kinds of disabilities better. I don't know if the racial disparity in educational outcomes got reduced under his watch, but education, of course, is such a gigantic topic. The caller points to one aspect, universal or not, pre-K and 3K.
No, I think that's right, Brian. In many ways, what the caller said was, yes, that expanding that program of universal pre-K would have been a policy slam dunk for Adams, particularly given his base. Now, what the mayor said at the time was he said that this program had been so mismanaged that there were certain neighborhoods in which you had empty seats, and the city was paying for that. And then we knew, based on reporting, that there were other neighborhoods where there was a lot of demand and not enough seats. But what the mayor did, which is what the mayor did repeatedly, was he was fixated on blaming the prior administration for this rather than attending to the problem at hand. He had an opportunity to really fix this. And ultimately, there was a lot of negotiation with the city council, and they did come to agreement that they were going to try to do more, just like the caller said, to promote these programs. A lot of experts said that no, the reason why we're not attracting enough children to these seats is because we're not advertising them in the right areas. We need to be going to, salons. We need to be going to churches. So by the time the mayor finally got around to that, it was already too late. In the court of public opinion, he had failed on what many people thought was one of the city's, most biggest achievements in education, which was establishing universal pre-K.
It's the Eric Adams years on WNYC before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years. And when we continue in a minute, we'll turn to one more very defining issue for Adams that also makes a very specific segue to Mamdani. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we are debriefing the Eric Adams years now before we segue into the Zohran Mamdani years. And last issue from the Adams years, crime. One major piece of continuity from the Adams to the Mamdani era will, of course, be the retention of Jessica Tisch as police commissioner. Here is Commissioner Tisch in September, boasting to Dan Menorino of Pix 11 how successful the Adams administration has been on that, despite some ongoing challenges, especially in the Bronx this summer.
A lot of it, Dan, is gang violence, and the mayor has been very clear with us. He wants us to go after gangs and guns, and we have done that in a big and frankly historic way this summer and this year. We have more gang takedowns this year than we have ever had in NYPD history. More guns off the street over the past 3.5 years under the mayor than ever in history. So those two ingredients, going after gangs, going after guns, in addition to having lots of cops out in footposts, precision policing in the right places, that has led to the historic crime declines that we are discussing today.
Commissioner Tisch in September. And one more time, our guests are WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffrey Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. And Ben, since you're sitting there at a law school and the topic at the moment is crime, how much can we say that despite anything else, Mayor Adams has largely been successful on his signature issue, public safety?
Well, I think it's much more of a mixed bag than voters expected when they elected Eric Adams as mayor is the sort of big picture takeaway here. There have been some very encouraging recent trends, but it took quite a bit longer than I think Eric Adams himself expected or many voters expected for some of the crime numbers to trend down. And much of it is still above pre-pandemic levels, but they've made some progress over the last couple of years. Eric Adams expected to make much more quick progress, but things like car thefts and assaults continue to rise rapidly under his watch for quite a while. But there's been some recent progress. And again, raising the question about, as a caller got at, how much of this is about what the NYPD doing and how much of it is about broader trends. And that relates to the debates over New York State criminal justice policy and its impact on crime. And we saw throughout the COVID era, crime increases across the country in places they didn't make those changes. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I think there's some significant trends in the right direction recently on crime numbers. And of course, that's part of the reason Mamdani has sought to retain Commissioner Tisch. But also, the functioning of the police department relates to the questions about appointments, chain of command, and cronyism and corruption that plagued the Adams years. And that's part of why Tisch has also been credited by Mamdani and others for cleaning up the department.
Liz Kim, same question.
This is another instance in which the mayor's rhetoric really undermined him. And in this case, it was really quite mystifying why he would do this. Early on in his term, he talked about crime as being out of control. And we knew from just looking at the statistics, and this was coming from a police officer who worked in an era where there was much higher crime in the city. But he was talking as if this was the highest crime rate the city has ever seen, despite the data saying something quite different. And then there was this idea where he put a lot of stock in perception. Not to say that it's entirely wrong, but it took him a really long time because he was so invested in how people were perceiving safety that it took him a long time to really try to get the public to believe in the data, because he kept saying, if you don't, it's not enough, it's not enough to be safe. You have to feel safe. Now, that is, that's not to discount the importance of perception, but there's so many factors that go into how someone feels safe. So I think that was a problem. I think that, yes, like Ben said, the caller made an excellent point. You can argue that, all major U.S. cities saw a drop in crime following the pandemic. Like, New York has not been different in that respect. So how much credit do you give the surge in policing? And yes, at the same time, shootings and murders are down, but we've also seen very disturbing rises in other types of crime, like felony assaults. My colleague Charles Lane has reported that felony assaults are actually up 80% since 2008. So it's a mixed picture, I would say. And I would say the other thing that the mayor tried to introduce a conversation about how policing can respond to mental health. But I feel like that is still an unfinished policy conversation in New York City.
Yeah. So Jeff, how much do you think the Mamdani administration will be trying to undo Adams' policies with respect to crime prevention versus just doing things of their own?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how Mamdani meshes with Jessica Tisch, who is to the right of him on certain issues like the effect of the raise the age law, bail reform, the extensive use of surveillance in the city that advocates have raised concerns about. So Mamdani has said he expects his commissioner to sort of follow his direction. We're going to see how that actually works out. I think with Eric Adams, one of the reasons he got elected, as Liz mentioned, is that his background as a police officer, gave a lot of people comfort at a time where, there were concerns, about riding the subway, about a number of mentally ill people, unfortunately, on the subway. And so that helped Mayor Adams get into office. He made the promise that he could police the city, but at the same time not violate people's civil rights. And what we've seen under him instead is an increase in the use of stop and frisk, much of which, according to the federal monitor, has been illegal stop and frisks. So we're hearkening back to 2014, those type of the highest numbers since 2014, when Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor De Blasio began winding down the use of stop and frisk. So I think that's one issue that will sort of dog his record on crime. At the same time as murders are dropping, we're seeing an increase in rapes in the city. I'm not sure the city has solved the issue with the NYPD and the bureau that investigates rapes. And finally, I think as Mayor Adams promised to certain communities in the city, there are just certain communities in the city, 7 or 8 communities where most of the gun violence takes place. We're seeing a disturbing trend in killings of very young people, teenagers, people who are 12, 14 years old, senior citizens being shot in broad daylight. So I think that is also going to be part of the mayor's legacy.
So, Liz, one final thought before we segue fully to the Mamdani years. You had a story about how everyone's been calling him the city's 111th mayor, but you ask, what if that number is wrong? Why would it be wrong?
Right. So I got an email it was maybe like a week after Election Day, where someone told me that, they had done some research and Mamdani was not going to be the 111th mayor. He was actually going to be the 112th mayor. And he kind of laid out some facts for me. And he also linked to another historian who had a similar story in the late 80s that was actually published in a journal. So I was completely hooked and fascinated. And I did reach out and talk to him. I reached out to the New York Historical Society, and they sort of verified some of the facts that this particular historian who lives in D.C., his name is Paul Hortenstein, had found. And yes, what Hortenstein and this other historian who is now deceased found was that in the 17th century, there was a mayor named Matthias Nichols. He's listed as the 6th mayor, but he was actually reappointed for another 1-year term. And at this time, mayors typically just served these short 1-year terms. But it's never recorded in the city's official record of mayors. And the question is why? And then another question is, will it be corrected? I spoke to the first deputy mayor, Randy Mastro, about this. He said he hadn't heard about this before, but he's going to leave it up to the Mamdani administration.
So I guess just as Grover Cleveland counted as 2 different presidential numbers in that sequence, having served 2 different terms, the same thing may apply here, and maybe Mayor Mamdani will be mayor number 112.
That's important. Yeah, that's important, Brian. We do count mayors if they're serving non-consecutive terms. Like one example was DeWitt Clinton. You do count them twice, similar to the way they do with U.S. presidents.
And so ends the Adams years on WNYC. Before we segue into the Mamdani years, we thank WNYC and Gothamist political reporter Elizabeth Kim, New York Times Metro political reporter Jeffrey Mays, and Ben Max, host of the Max Politics podcast and program director at New York Law School's Center for New York City Law. Thank you all so much for your reporting and your time today.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.